Hello, my name is Sorcha Simons and I'm an Insight Manager at Lumina. Today I'm going to be taking you through our latest webinar, specifically looking at the evolution of the forecourt consumer, looking at trends that we're seeing in the market and also future opportunities. And I'll do this using both data from our convenience tracking panel, which many of you may be familiar with, but also data from a bespoke piece of research that we recently carried out with 1,000 consumers, kind of delving a little bit deeper into forecourts and into the forecourt shopper, really looking at what's going on in the market and what consumers are predicting in the longer term. So a bit of an agenda for today's session. I'll start with a brief overview of what's going on in the forecourt market, and I'll do this using data from our convenience tracking panel. And then I'll delve into the consumer segment of our research, where we'll examine attitudes as well as emerging opportunities that we've identified in the sector as a result of our findings. So for a bit of market context, there are three kind of key macro trends that are really top of mind in the forecourt sector at the moment. So despite fuel prices levelling off a little bit over the past year, the outlook for 2024, unfortunately, is less than positive. And this is due to shipping attacks in the Red Sea, which have led to fears that improvements could actually be reversed. And these rising fuel prices do pose a real challenge to the sector as the cost of living crisis is persisting, consumer confidence is still in the negative, and high interest rates are making rent and mortgage payments quite high. So consumer spending power is really restrained. In September, the government actually announced that they would be extending the proposed ban on petrol and diesel cars, which was set to come in 2030. And it was set to mean that all new cars on the road had to be electric rather than petrol and diesel. However, the possibility of a new government being elected in 2025 could see this reversed. So this is a slightly uncertain change. And despite this backtracking, the past year has actually seen progress towards getting more electric vehicles on the road, with 43% more charging points actually available in the UK this year than last. So this is making electric vehicle ownership a lot more feasible for many people. So now looking at spend on shop items in forecourts over the past 2 years, quite interestingly, as you can see from the graph, spend in forecourts is a lot more volatile than in the average convenience market, and it really retracted last March. And this was a time when food inflation was actually at the highest point in 45 years, I believe, which is since records began. And this therefore led to consumers really trying to cut back on non-essential spend and kind of cutting back on convenience missions as a whole. But the volatility of the forecourt market, as you can see, really does demonstrate that demand is a lot less stable than in convenience and a lot more susceptible to market change. And this is due to kind of the nature of the channel. People aren't necessarily going there because they need something. It is more non-essential and a lot more impulsive. So people are purchasing things in store when they're going to top up their cars. So therefore, there's a real need for the forecourt market to try and focus on keeping demand consistent. And then to focus on engaging the forecourt market, we need to really understand who the forecourt shopper is. So data from Lumina's convenience tracking panel tells us that forecourt shoppers are more likely to be younger, more likely to be male, and also more likely to live with their partner and children than the typical convenience shopper. So this data on screen essentially shows these demographics that are really over-indexing versus the total convenience market. So showing kind of the nuances within the forecourt sector. So what this means is, what we can infer from these findings, is that ranges and messaging should really focus on targeting this consumer group to try and maintain that consistent forecourt demand that we really have seen from the previous graph is really, really essential. And now looking at our psychographics data for forecourt shoppers. So our psychographics are essentially values that consumers say that they align themselves with. So for example, when purchasing something in convenience, they're more led by value, by brand, by sustainability, and they actually rank these out of 6. So this gives us a really good understanding of what it is that's driving shoppers to store. As you can see from the graph, there are a number of over-indexes. So quality, brand, experience, and health have all actually over-indexed, notably for forecourt shoppers. And brand and quality are really critical. This is due to the fact that shoppers in forecourts do have much shorter dwell times. They're going in just to pay for their petrol. So seeing recognisable brands is really, really key, as it does kind of feed into that impulsive mission and mean that shoppers are more likely to pick something up as it's something that they've purchased before. So now delving into the results of our bespoke consumer study. A key finding from our research was that location, convenience, and ease of use were really core motivators behind consumers' forecourt preference. But what's really interesting here is that nearly a third of consumers actually stated that better quality fuel motivated their forecourt choice. And this demonstrates the importance of emphasising fuel quality and also the importance of convenience stores within higher quality fuel stations. And now looking at services that consumers say they look for in forecourts, and specifically those that our sample stated were either extremely important or very important. And we can see that the most important service to consumers is actually good customer service. And 62% stated that this was either very or extremely important for forecourt choice. So this is a really key factor to be focusing on in order for forecourts to differentiate from the competition. We're also seeing air and water is really key here, but also quite interestingly, good toilet facilities. And this is something that's particularly important for forecourts on major transport routes where people will be stopping for breaks. But what should be noted alongside this is that there is actually quite a high level of satisfaction with existing services. So as you can see on screen, 84% of consumers actually said they can think of any other services that they wanted in forecourts. So this is really positive, and it does indicate that the current market is performing well in the eyes of consumers. So then looking at other services that consumers are using in forecourts that can therefore be used to increase custom and achieve that kind of market stability that we have identified as really important. So we can see nearly a third of customers are actually using pay at pump. And pay at pump does tap into that importance of forecourts being convenient and also easy to use, which we know is really key. However, it is something of a double-edged sword, and this is because it does negate that need to visit convenience stores. So it does affect custom in that sense. Nonetheless, though, we can see that convenience stores are really key to many consumers, with 29% actually stating that they still use them as well as fuel, so they're not going anywhere. And the popularity of air and water again here further demonstrates its importance, and this is actually a facility that can still often be used alongside pay at pump, so really, really key. As I'm sure we all know, there's a lot of discussion across the industry around electric vehicles at the moment. So in our research, we set out to look at consumer interest in different fuel types. And as you can see from the slide, petrol cars actually do remain the most popular, but we can see quite a large amount of consumer interest in hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and also those classic electric vehicles. So that does indicate a bit of a shift towards electric cars. But then if we look at EV demand on a longer term basis, what's really interesting is that we can see quite a high consumer purchase intention, but this is in the next 5 to 10 years, with a third of consumers actually stating that they'll definitely buy an electric vehicle in 10 years. So this is something that forecourts are going to have to adjust to, with an increased focus on EV charging points in long-term strategy. As while 30% have said they definitely will buy, only 8% have stated that they definitely would not buy an electric vehicle in the next 10 years. So this is a really, really key market to be engaging with. And now if we look at recharging among EV consumers, we can see that home charging is actually preferential, whereas for forecourts, just over half of EV users are actually visiting at least once a week or more. And when we think about visit frequency in relation to petrol cars, most drivers are visiting on a weekly basis. So what this means is that forecourts need to really try and focus on differentiating offerings, particularly for non-fuel occasions, so they can really maintain that relevance into the future and continue usage when more consumers are actually refueling at home. So as we were saying, to combat that shift towards home recharging, focusing on these non-fuel missions in forecourts is really key. So we actually found that in the current market, 32% of consumers said that they would stop in forecourts even if they weren't purchasing fuel. And this is quite an interesting finding. And then we asked consumers why it was and what they'd stop for. And they said that toilets, hot food, and also coffee and convenience stores drove over half of these non-fuel consumers to forecourts. So these are really key offerings to try and focus on to maintain that forecourt demand alongside the rise in EV. And now from a retail perspective, an example of a brand tapping into the specific demands of forecourts is Early Bird, and they're focusing specifically on the coffee market, but more specifically the ready-to-drink coffee market, which is actually quite beneficial as many forecourts might not have hot coffee machines. And this was launched in September 2023 in partnership with Motor Fuel Group, which is the UK's largest independent forecourt operator. And the brand is focusing on both quality and value. So it has quite impactful packaging, as you can see, but it's also got a really low and really accessible price point of just £1.49. The can packaging is also recyclable, so appealing to consumer demands for sustainability, which is really, really key given the rise in EV. And the brand's been launched across all 700 of MFG sites, so it really just does demonstrate the demand for ready-to-drink coffee in the forecourt channel. So now we know that consumers are interested in EV, so we can look at why this is. And while legislation will mean that the only new cars available after at least 2035 will be electric, consumers' motivations for purchasing these vehicles is primarily environmental focused, with 43% actually stating that they'd purchase electric vehicles to reduce emissions. And then if we look at who these emissions-led EV buyers are, so on the screen, we essentially have the demographics who have said that they'd buy EVs to reduce emissions. And these are the demographics that over-index more versus the total market. So these are essentially the consumers who have said that they'd buy EVs to reduce emissions. And we can really see that the shopper groups that forecourts need to be focusing on are primarily female, aged 45 to 54 or 55 to 64. They're also working in intermediate or managerial positions, again, living with their partner and children, and also in semi or unskilled manual roles. And what this means and what this reinforces is that need for mid-range pricing in forecourts and also a family offer. And this will really help engage with the needs of the future forecourt shopper and enable forecourts to kind of be a lot more sustainable into the future. So that's it from me. A few key messages that have really emerged from our consumer research that I'll leave you with. Firstly, the fact that good customer service was really crucial for meeting consumer needs, being the top consumer need in forecourts, with 62% saying it was either extremely or very important. And this is something that forecourts should really, really focus on and really emphasize in staff training strategy. Secondly, another key point emerging from our research was that consumers have long-term intentions to purchase EVs, with 30% actually stating that they definitely buy them in 10 years, and only 8% stating that they definitely wouldn't. And then with that rise in EV comes the rise in non-fuel forecourt shoppers, and focusing on convenience, hot food, ready-to-drink coffee, and also toilets can really engage with that non-fuel forecourt shopper. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any further questions about the research or about the Decatur or just Lumina in general, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. Thanks so much.